Well, Matt, thanks for having me. Excited to talk a little bit with your audience about leveraging data to build community consensus. I appreciate you and Matt and all the work that y'all are doing for SEDC. I feel like you guys have done an amazing job the past few years of really elevating the brand and supporting communities. So appreciate you guys and your work. My name is Tanner Jones with Steadfast City Economic Community Partners. I am a recovering local economic developer, so have sat in the shoes of many of you and understand what it's like to be in the business recruitment and industrial development world that many of you sit in. I'm also a bit of a data nerd at heart, so that's kind of where my background is in both data and marketing. And so now that I'm in the consulting space, doing a lot of work and support for communities across the country in that same space. But I wanted to dive into a topic that's kind of near and dear to me, which is kind of being able to leverage the data that many of you already have access to build community consensus and ultimately create action and activity within your community that can help you in the economic development process. And so as we dive in that today, I just want to, we'll reframe some ideas that you may already have about data and how to use the data that you have, but really want to empower you and give you some opportunities to hopefully go one step further with information that you may already have. Just to give you a little bit of background on Steadfast City and our company, we're a younger firm. We're about 6 years old. We've grown super fast and have at this point 34 consultants located across the country. We're a completely remote team. We do have offices in St. Louis, in Rochester, New York, and then also here in Mobile, Alabama, where I am, actually in Fairhope, Alabama, for those of you that have been to my neck of the woods. And so we're doing a lot of work with communities across the country, in the Southeast and the Southern U.S. We've done work in Florida and Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana. And we're also, we do a lot of work in the Midwest. So a lot of work in Missouri and Illinois. And then, we're slowly but surely kind of branching out and getting into new markets across the country. But really our goal is to develop better communities. We take a little bit of a different approach to economic community development than most firms. We're trying to build a truly holistic firm that can bring a lot of different pieces to the table for our clients, whether those are businesses or government entities or development groups or even real estate developers. We do a lot of work with nonprofits as well, and so what we found is that each of those groups individually are working towards very similar goals often. So whether that's workforce development, community development, or economic development within their community, everybody kind of wants the same thing, right? But oftentimes they're working in silos and kind of working on their own little projects or their own big projects, and not necessarily looping in all the assets that they have in their community. And so that's something we kind of specialize in, just because we have such a diverse background and team of folks that come from different perspectives. Just to talk a little bit about our different teams and different kinds of work we do. We have an economic development planning team, which is probably most relevant to this audience. We do a lot of strategic planning, economic impact studies, target industry studies, and analysis on that front. But then we also provide support to these other project teams that need to understand an economic developer's perspective as we're tackling some more complex problems or development projects. That's the team that I primarily work on. Now also kind of leading our charge for marketing and business development and strategic partnerships for the firm. But that is where my background lies, and so I spend a lot of time working with communities on economic development strategies and marketing strategies, and kind of trying to help communities and organizations kind of take their best next step from an economic development standpoint. We also have a community planning team that is primarily composed of trained planners. So um, the people that are sometimes considered an enemy of economic development, probably to some of your from some of your communities and perspectives. We believe that pulling all of these groups together is what kind of makes us unique and gives us a unique perspective. And so, what we've been able to do cross collaboratively with that team is kind of develop some processes that allow for maximizing economic impact and understanding what economic impact can be and how that can be impacted by the planning process, and then vice versa. How can planning and zoning and regulations within a community ultimately impact economic development in a positive way? And we do a lot of community engagement work and local kind of neighborhood level studies and housing studies and things that that are integral to a community's ultimate success that may not be immediately thought of as part of the economic development process, but can obviously pave the way for a lot of success in your community. We have a grants and fund development team. I'll go through these a little bit quicker, but we've got a grants team. We do a lot of grant writing, grant management, and compliance work, and then also seek out and find grants. Try to build capital stacks for our clients in a lot of different ways. Our site selection, labor analytics is typical site selection for businesses. We do have a team that primarily works on site selection and incentives negotiation on behalf of our clients. We've done projects across the country, and you might see us or somebody from that team in your neck of the woods here in the near future. We've got a real estate credits and incentives team as well. So we do a lot of work with real estate developers and folks that are looking to do redevelopment projects. We're often able to connect that to the economic development team, the community planning team, and even the grants team, and try to figure out how do we make a project pencil out, whether it's in a downtown or it's a redevelopment project, an industrial park. There's a lot of opportunities for us to creatively figure out how to make a project work, and ultimately, we try to show up to the community with a case for why it's going to be impactful for them. I know a lot of my time when I was working in local economic development, we had projects and consultants show up with the handout initially, and our goal really is to show up with the case for why this is good for the community and figure out how to make it work for everybody involved. And then we do new markets work as well. So we are kind of the broker between the development project and the CDE or funding mechanism. So if you have a project that you think is eligible for new markets, you can always reach out to us, and we can tell you if it makes sense. So kind of you'll see some of those themes of kind of cross collaboration and talk about among our teams as we're talking through the data piece today. But want to just kind of frame what I believe economic developers to be, and that is data leaders within your communities. You often hold more data than anybody else in the community about your community, which is great thing to have in your hands, as long as you're maximizing that data as much as you can. And if you don't hold it, a lot of times you have easy access to it, or through a partnership, or additional stakeholder in the community. And so I think traditionally that's something that economic developers have grasped, at least over the past 10 years or so, 10 or 15 years, and started to understand the importance of data and decision making. And so the primary uses that you're probably used to kind of diving into data for. And obviously I'm using the term data broad because I want you to be able to kind of frame this appropriately for whatever role you sit in. But your first, one of your key data uses is to impress or influence a prospect. A lot of times you're being asked to provide information that is selling your community to somebody on the outside, and that's something that's extremely important to have ready to go. And a lot of times that really drives the data and information that's collected within an economic development organization. Um, there's also a tendency and to use the data to create a positive community narrative for external audiences, whether that's an active prospect or somebody that you're trying to target. And so that's a great thing as well. Obviously, that's key part of your job. And ultimately, that's something that you need to continue to do. We're just going to talk a little bit differently about how you kind of convert that into a little bit different narrative. And then another, key data use is just answering questions for stakeholders. A lot of times, you've got people within your community that want the data that you have, and they want to get access to as much as they possibly can as they're trying to make key decisions, and that's a great thing to be able to inform them as much as possible. So, obviously, each of you knows that there are several key moments for data collection that are most typical within within your economic development process. You might have a new data inquiry, whether that's coming from a stakeholder or a prospect. A lot of times, you will find new data or new key data points from a question that gets asked, right? And so that's always a great moment to pause, reflect, and try to understand what the data and information means as you're feeding it back to the person that requests it. Again, also through the RFP process, that's something that as you're filling out proposals for prospects, something that you're certainly you're going to be asked something that you may or may not have the answer to, and you might end up going out and finding new data and information for your community, and that's great. I mean, use that as a learning opportunity. And then curiosity. I mean, we all go down those rabbit trails of on YouTube or Wikipedia or wherever, and try our best to we start off researching what happened with the fall of the Roman Empire, and then we end up ultimately learning how the company Dell was founded, right? And so, same thing with our communities. We might launch off into a question or try to solve a problem for an RFP or a data inquiry, and then we're like, oh, that's interesting. Let's dive a little deeper. And a lot of times, that's where the best ideas are found in the ED data process. A lot of times, people get large swaths of new data or a huge refresh at one time. Nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that if you do that, you really understand what you're diving into. A lot of times, if you're doing a website refresh or a marketing refresh, you'll try to find new data points that you can market at that time. And then sometimes you're doing community benchmarking, right? I mean, you're trying to figure out how does my community look against this other community or against a like community that that we're trying to emulate or become. And so, that's certainly another great time to collect data. So most of you and your EDOs are pretty used to collecting data in each of those ways. And so I would challenge you, so I got this kind of 1, 2, 3, 4 step process to reframe a little bit how you're looking at the data that's collected in those moments, in those key moments that you're collecting the data. So first off, as you come across a new data point, I think you can, always kind of go back through this process and see how does this relate to these questions. So first off, it's important to understand what your community says about itself, right? So nobody knows that better than you, but certainly nobody knows that better than your residents and your stakeholders and everybody else. Your community has an understanding of what it is, whether it's accurate or not. There is a perception within your community that this is who we are, this is what we're good at. Sometimes there are communities that think they have assets or are good in certain areas and they're not. Sometimes there are communities that think they're struggling or in a rough spot or unable to compete in certain areas, and they really aren't. I mean, they really can compete and they really can be competitive based on the data that they have. And that's one reason that the community benchmarking is so important. But kind of taking it a step further from, okay, well, this is what people think about my community that live in my community. How do you get from that to, well, I know what my community says about itself, but what does my community look like on paper, right? So I know that my community may say that we are a great target for aerospace projects, but do I really have any assets in my community that that's workforce assets or existing employers that are in the aerospace industry? Maybe my community believes that it is struggling and maybe has a high poverty rate. Well, is that true? Is that actually what my community is comprised of? Maybe there's a certain area of your community that you think is, or that your community says, oh, this area over here, they're struggling the most, and maybe you look at the data and you realize that that's not necessarily true. They may be struggling, just maybe not to the degree that you think, or it may be that, oh my gosh, this area over here is actually struggling and in need more than the area that I was looking at. And so now that you kind of understand what your community looks like on paper, what the data says about your community, what you look like on paper. The third step would be, I know what my community looks like on paper, but what does that data actually say about my community? So what does it mean, right? So I know that I have 7,000 veterans that live in my community. Is that a good thing? Everything's relative, right? So this is a great time to do some benchmarking and try to figure out exactly whether those data points that may sound nice to you, are they actually positives for your community? Maybe there's something that you think is a negative that really is a positive that you don't know is a huge asset for your community. As you're going through that RFP process and you're getting asked questions by consultants, are you able to answer those questions in a way that paints a good light for your community? That's something that's sometimes extremely hard to do and understand. Obviously, you don't lie, you don't misrepresent your community, but there may be ways to fill some gaps that you don't know exist right now. And then, so once you kind of have an understanding of what the data says about your community, how do you then leverage that data to incite action in your community? That's the thing that I think we're going to focus on a lot here is how do you actually make that data make a difference in your community, not just in a project that you're trying to win, but in the community as you're building a narrative about your actual community where you live. And then ultimately, it's going to influence each of the previous 3 steps as well as you improve your community's data story. So as you kind of think about that, there's an extra layer of opportunity here that I think want to make sure that we focus in on. Economic development is not the sole user of data within your community, whether that's census data or labor data or whatever you're looking at. There are other groups and other problems that you're trying to solve within your community that can be answered using this data. And so I want to go through each of these just briefly to kind of talk through a little bit about how these data points that you uncover may shape the way your community approaches each of these things, right? So from a workforce development standpoint, obviously there's a lot of opportunity in the workforce development space right now. It's something that everybody continues to focus in on, which is great. But how's the data that you're putting out about your community informing workforce development? Are you talking about success that you're having recruiting certain types of businesses, but maybe your pipeline's not quite keeping up? Are you talking about recruiting certain businesses and you've got your workforce development team kind of off working on certain initiatives that may or may not ultimately work out for your community, right? So you may be working on something that's a little. I'm gonna pause for a second. I don't know what the heck's happening, but my computer's going crazy. Hold on just a second. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. All right. So as you're working through the workforce development process, you may have a group that is that's working on workforce initiatives for programs that you've got them working on, but maybe that's not really a need in the community. you don't really know exactly what the data says as to whether or not that's something that you should be working on. In the education space, I think this is something that really can set the tone, especially if as you're thinking about like K-12 education. Got an example of a project that we worked on when I was in the local space, where we had the school system kind of dictating and choosing which career tech programs existed within the school system. That was great. They were doing a great job of supporting and growing that base of work, base of students within career tech education, but at times they were maybe pushing people into careers that weren't necessarily as lucrative, or maybe the wages weren't in the place that they needed to be. And so we had an opportunity to take a look at average wages for each of the programs that they were trying to send students into. And we were about to make a larger push for career tech as an asset for K-12 students. And in order to do that, we wanted to feel confident that if we push students into these careers, that they would ultimately be successful and make a competitive wage in a way that obviously all parents would want them to, and certainly that they would want to as they launch a career. And so what we're able to do is take some of the programs that they were really focused on and show them that maybe the wages weren't really there for us to be pushing students into a certain area, and then also open their eyes to some new opportunities that they may not have been aware of for for specific programs that would open doors that students may not even be aware of because the school system wasn't aware of. Again, for urban planning, I think this is something that we can really dive into here at Steadfast. There's a lot of opportunity for you to influence what your planners think about your community, whether the opportunities are there, where's the area, where's the key area for growth. You can even influence some funding and project funding, whether that's, hey, sometimes planners are like, well, we started building sidewalks in this direction, so I guess we'll just keep going in this direction. But is that really the thing that's going to open up economic opportunity for your community? Maybe you can show them pockets of growth within the community that are exceeding expectations, and maybe refocus some efforts. In the community development space, I think it's in the same vein. We've got a few clients right now that we're really helping them understand how community development can be done in a way that is data informed, and not just through the census data, but that is a huge piece of it. A lot of times, narrative of what the community says about itself, that narrative is what really bleeds action in the community development space, and that's okay. But sometimes it's not accurate. It's something that we spend a lot of time helping our clients try to understand. And there's a mix there, right? I mean, sometimes there's local knowledge that's not revealed in the data too. So I'm not saying you don't consider that either, but a lot of times people are at least misinformed about what the situations are in the community. Incentive strategy, we'll talk about incentive strategy, wage discussions, and your target industries in kind of one cluster. That's something that I think is extremely important as you're trying to decide which types of companies and which projects to incentivize within your community, and how much so to incentivize each of those. A lot of times, I think economic developers can be driven by their motivation to have a win, right? And that's okay. That's your job. But as you're trying to grow your community strategically, I think you can really look at that wage number, especially as an opportunity to make change within your community. If you've got a lot of, odds are you have a lot of businesses that are within your community that are already looking at wage data, and trying to understand how the heck can they afford the inflationary wages that we've seen over the past several years. And that's a good thing that people are trying to understand that. Some businesses aren't going to be able to handle that. And that's an unfortunate part of the economic development process is that sometimes businesses can't keep up if you're successful. But if your job is to look out for the benefit of your community members, which I believe for most of you that is the case, even if you have investors or stakeholders who are business owners, I totally understand that happens. You have to ultimately try to create and raise the floor and ceiling for wage opportunities in your community. And so you can really incentivize projects based on wages or job create, not just job creation totals, but what types of jobs are being created within the community. And that can inform your target industries and who you want to go after in the same way that the education system, needs to be informed of what types of training to offer. So again, these are just extra layers where you can take the data a little bit deeper as you're trying to have that reframe the conversation a little bit. So once you've got the data reframed and you're thinking about it a little bit differently, how do you then get the information out to your community? Because the goal here is to leverage it for community action and influence your community. So first off, I think it's important to sell your community to itself. This is something that I think sometimes economic developers are a little bit hesitant to do, to talk openly about the data that they push out to prospects. But your recruitment narrative is extremely versatile. So you've got a lot of really great data points, most likely that you're including and you're trying to sell prospects on your community. But why not turn the microphone, or the megaphone away from the prospect every once in a while and shout back to your community and make sure that your community is aware of just how great it is, right? I mean, that's a huge piece of what your community can do. Sorry, got my computer's waking out again. Let me disconnect this here. All right, maybe that'll be the last issue. And then, kind of taking the next step, ultimately your community wants to feel good about itself. If your community can feel good about the data that is being provided external, then they should feel good about that every day, right? They should be seeing that data all the time. We can get that out on social and get your community aware of what that pitch is, of what the positive points are for your community. And then I would say don't be scared of repetition. This is something that I have a lot of clients struggle with a lot. They're like, oh well, this we need something new. We need something fresh because it's we're just not we need we got to keep rolling with new stuff. And yes, I mean hopefully you can continue to find new data points and new selling points for your community. But don't be afraid to repeat the same information and data. That's something that is, I think, extremely underrated. We struggle with that too at Steadfast as we're talking about our company, right? I may hop on 6 calls in the day and give the same exact pitch for what Steadfast is doing and what we're working on. It can become repetitive to me, but each of those 6 individuals that heard it are new people, right? That haven't ever heard our pitch. And so it's important to make sure that everybody, not just external, but within your community understands what your selling points are for your community. And then reframe your negatives where possible. We'll dive a little bit deeper into that in a minute. There may be data points about your community. You're like, gosh, I hope nobody ever Googles, what our population growth is, because they will be sorely disappointed. And that may be the case. But there are ways to reframe those. You just may have to take one step a little bit further in the data process, in the data analytics process to find that data point. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, diving in a little bit deeper to leveraging those negatives for positive momentum. And at this point, as I was putting this presentation together, I got a little silly. So thanks for the, hope y'all get some laughs from the emojis here. But not every data point is flattering for your community. That's that's okay. Like don't think that that's a bad thing. Even in the fastest growing communities, there are data points that are not great. And there are certainly individuals out there who may latch on to some great data points that that they think are negatives, right? We've always got, we've all got the NIMBYs and the folks that don't want to see growth in our community. But I will say that there's one thing that you can be guilty of, and that is kind of hiding all the negative data from your community and then not giving them the opportunity to influence or correct that data point, right? So you can't fix a problem if you don't know it exists. So if you've got a low wage rate in your community, let's say, it may create some difficult conversations for you to have to go and talk to your businesses and say, hey, the reason you're losing workers is because these businesses in the next town over or this other business that's right next door to you is paying more based on the data that we have. Not that you're sharing original wage data, but if you can look at wage data from JobsEQ or Lightcast or some data source that or even just BLS data that has some sort of average, you can go make that have that conversation and maybe open their eyes to the fact that they either are going to have to pay more to be competitive, or they may not be able to operate successfully in your community, and that's just just how it is. But they can't make that decision if they're not informed, right? In the same way, if you have maybe you have an area of your community that believes it is prosperous, but ultimately there's a lot of poverty in that area. If you just pretend that every area in your community is prosperous and thriving, then nobody's ever going to turn their glasses over toward the community that is that's struggling, right? Nobody's ever going to open their eyes to what's going on in that community. So sometimes you have to shine a negative light on something in order to incite some change and action, right? And that can be, you have to be very strategic about that. But I think it's important to remember that it's not always rainbows and butterflies, even though that's your job to present that to the outside world. I think if you're talking to a prospect, you want to stay away from the negatives all the time. But if you're talking internally to your community, there may be things that you can influence and change in a good way. Also, your perceptions may not be reality. So, again, your community may think something about itself that's just not true. And so it's important, and that could be a positive thing too, right? Your community may think, oh my gosh, we've got an interstate going through our community, so we must be a great location for, any sort of, transportation related project. And that's not always the case. I mean, it's certainly an asset to have an interstate flowing through your community. But just because you have an interstate doesn't mean you have all the pieces lined up to be, some sort of logistics hub, right? So trying to open people's eyes so that people may start making financial decisions and land use decisions based on what you're telling them. But if you're not really able to make that pitch to the company or to the prospect, then you're kind of wasting your time, and maybe there are other areas where you could be more impactful. So just be careful that you don't avoid informing your community of what's there just because it's something that they have a preconceived idea of. And then also ultimately, this, in my opinion, the negatives are what most justify your need for economic development work in your community and can drive your strategic approach to economic growth in your community. There's nobody else that's going to do it, right? You're the one to lead the charge, and so if everything's always rainbows and butterflies, I don't know, do they really need you, right? If everything's going great, do they really need somebody to be focused on economic development growth? So I think it's important to kind of shine a light on opportunities for positive momentum in a way that you can influence your economy, and ultimately I think it's helps you remain stable in your position and keep your eye on the ball as you're trying to improve your community. So obviously throughout this, as you're maybe pushing more, if the result of this, hearing this conversation is to push the more data out to your community. It's still important that you control the narrative, right, about economic development in your community. So who determines what economic development success looks like in your community? Is it the residents and what they think? Is it what you say? That some people have enough sway in your community that what they say looks like success is equals success, and that's great. That's a great position to be in. Not always the case. Are there like three people who have the loudest voice who ultimately determine what success looks like? Are there ways to influence those people, or to create such a strong narrative that's data driven, that ultimately you're the one that's dictating what success looks like in your community? And maybe success is recruiting 10 new businesses this year, but maybe it's also improving a certain community, or improving a neighborhood, or getting new street lamps put in your downtown. Like, there are a lot of different ways that economic development success can ultimately lead to the big announcement or the fun project. And then also, who can tell the story of economic development success in your community? Odds are you can, which is a good thing. You're the economic developer. I hope that you can tell that success story. There are probably others that work alongside you frequently. Hopefully, your elected officials, your workforce development officials, your partners at the state, local level who understand your community. Hopefully, you have resources in them, and that they can be part of your success story. But I also think that there are opportunities for you to really leverage the voice of your community members to make your community proud of itself, as we talked about a little bit, and then have them understand what success looks like, so that when you have a success and when you have something that drives success in your community, it also is something they could pick up and tout as, wow, look at what we're doing. This is really awesome. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'd say the fruits of building the community consensus, right? The fruits of having your community, kind of be your vocal supporters of economic development, is that shiny things become shinier. If you can get the message out via the data to your community, then ultimately they're going to really latch on to those positives that you have. Or they're going to latch on to the negatives and say, hey, this is something we need to fix. And that opportunity becomes shinier, right? It becomes something that people want to be involved in. And then the gaps become more obvious, and your community knows where to take action. This is something that I think, again, may require a little, talking about the negative a little bit. But there's always plenty of opinions. There's plenty of people who think they know everything about the community, and maybe they do, maybe they're right, but they may not be. And there may be opportunities for you to drive consensus through the data, and fill some of those gaps. And then this is probably the most important one, in my opinion, is that data becomes part of your community's language, and you ultimately develop a broader marketing team, right? So we have, when when I was working locally in economic development, I think the most proud moment that I've had, and I've told several people this, so you may have heard the story before, but is that one day there was a week where I published a data point on our LinkedIn page, and that Sunday our pastor at our church actually used the data point in his sermon to show what opportunities we had at our church. It's just like, I go to an extremely large church, so it's not like I was feeding him the data directly. And so I realized at that point, not only did I convert him into a mouthpiece for the data narrative that we were trying to push, but also his audience of 3,000 to 4,000 people that Sunday, right? And so that's something that it's a simple story, but I think, if you're able to develop a broader marketing team of community members just by informing them and getting the data out to them in a strategic way, um, and that's something that if you don't have, hopefully you have the resources internally to do that. If you don't, you know, latch on to your partners or reach out to me, and let's figure out how we can make it work for you, because I think it's something that is going to can be extremely impactful for you, and it can turn the narrative for growth and change and opportunity into a positive one for a lot of people, right, that may have been seeing it as a negative. We all get convicted on Sunday morning of something, so might as well be a positive for economic development. And then, kind of next step, data driven businesses can understand your team's intentional decisions. So again, we talked a little bit about the kind of target industries and how the data can inform your business development process and how you incentivize projects. Well, if a business is making a data-driven decision, they may get frustrated, of course, if you tell them no in a certain area. But if you can justify it and say, hey, this is why it's not driving the impact that we need in our community, whether that's wages are too low or investments too low or the job numbers are too low, or whatever the thing is that you're latching on to. Maybe it's, hey, we've got this building and it's our only building, and we want somebody successful to be in there. We think you'll be successful, but we don't think you'll maximize our economic impact. And so, we don't think it's the best opportunity. If you can prove that to them, show them what the economic impact of that project is and could be if you're successful with somebody else, they should understand that. They may be frustrated, but if they're making data-driven decisions, then they're going to understand your data-driven decisions, and that's important. And then ultimately, you can impact the data trend and shift your community standing, right? If there's something that you want to influence, so let's say that's wage data again. If there's something that you want to influence in a positive direction, then start talking about it and figuring out how to change it. It'll take time; it's not going to happen overnight. But there are ways that you can impact those trends and show how the investment pays off in certain areas, and what the economic impacts actually are on the community. And then most importantly, the fruits of your work become measurable if you're looking at that data trend and trying to understand how you're improving your community. And that's important. I think you want the fruits of your work to be something that can be touted, not just as well, I'm a great salesperson, so I can talk anybody into doing anything, in my community. Well, that's great, but if you can actually drive change and be impactful, then you have the opportunity to change lives and be the best economic developer that you can be for your community, not just for yourself or for your ego. And then what to watch out for, a few things to be careful about as you're trying to kind of build that data narrative within your community. One, the timeliness of sharing data. If you've got an active project that could be negatively impacted by something, maybe there is a negative in your community that you uncover during the RFP process, or as you are having a conversation with a prospect, and that prospect says, hey, this is a concern of ours. How can you fix it? Well, it's your job to be creative and find a creative solution, obviously. But I wouldn't immediately go out to LinkedIn or go out to your local Facebook page and say, hey, did y'all know that we don't actually have any workers in the aerospace industry? So that's not what I'm saying. So you have to be timely with that data. You've got an active project. You certainly don't want to publish something that's going to put you in a bind. But if you can take feedback from a prospect and turn that into timely action, then that's great as well. So just be careful of what you're pushing out there. Second, you can't control every situation. Don't don't pretend that you can't. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you're the only person that can get things done in your community. There are others, and you may need to activate them, and it may be difficult, but you can't control every situation. Sometimes you have to inform people and trust that they're going to take action. Maybe it's a nonprofit group, maybe it's a developer, maybe it's a workforce development official, whoever it is. Sometimes you just have to give them the information and say, hey, this is the problem. Can you help us find a solution? Because you're juggling a lot of balls, and there's just no way you can do it all. And so if you want to maximize your impact, you're going to have to maybe step outside your comfort zone a little bit and trust that others can make the change for you, right? It's a little bit like letting go of your balloon, but hopefully it doesn't float off into Netherland. Thirdly, some community members or stakeholders may have conflicting narratives. So don't be surprised if you come across a group that maybe thinks differently about a data-driven action that you're trying to take. I've seen examples in communities where even the economic development groups and the Chamber of Commerce, at least the business side of the chamber, might have some conflicts, right? Let's go back to the wage conversation, for instance. Like the chambers represent the businesses, and they're there for the businesses, and they want to advocate for their businesses, and that's great. And that's what we need those people and those partners. But there may be times where advocating for a business requires them to kind of look away from the truth that the business may not be taking care of their employees, right? So how do you kind of have that delicate conversation? I would encourage you to have the conversation. Like if conflict is apparent, don't just poke the beast for the heck of it. Like go have a conversation with somebody and say, hey, this is why we're doing this. This is what we expect the result to be. And so I think as you pull all this together, you'll start to see that a lot of times things that are viewed as negative can be flipped for the positive, and ultimately drive some positive narrative in the community. If people understand that it's data informed, it's not just what Joe Schmo said. This is what some data tools are telling you is the truth, and those are the same tools that people are using to make decisions on the business end as well. I'll leave with one story. This is the last little bit here. I had a client of ours recently that was in a kind of flat growth area. They've had some really big city flat growth area. They've had some folks moving out of their kind of city center and into the suburbs in a kind of relocation of wealth and population situation. And there's no dodging it. It's something that is well known by any business that comes and looks in that community and is looking at a certain area within that community. They're going to know that this is not the most thriving location or economy. But what we were able to do recently with that client is dig just one step deeper to kind of give them an opportunity to hopefully find some light in an otherwise not so happy situation, right? What we did, we were benchmarking them against some other communities, kind of sister communities across their region, and when we did that, we found that their GDP growth was actually pretty hefty, considering that they were having that the flight of people outside of their community. And so even though population growth was ultimately pretty flat or even negative at times, there was new investment and new business coming into their community. And so what we did was kind of reframed that, and we looked at how much GDP is being, if we're looking at a community like Nashville, say, obviously tons of investment, tons of new residents coming in. But from a percentage standpoint and kind of relative to the number of people they're growing in, maybe they're they might have a X amount of GDP growth per capita, right? Based on the number of new people who were coming in. And so one thing that we were able to show in this community was that even though there wasn't a lot of population growth, it didn't mean that their economy wasn't thriving. And what we've continued to do for them, once we uncovered that little tidbit, was dive a little bit deeper. And now we're able to see that their efficiency is significantly higher in this community, and that their output per resident is extremely high, and something that they need to be touting. And so we've been able to take an otherwise kind of negative narrative and flip it a little bit to say, like, okay, maybe we're not the hottest place to live in the world, and that's okay. But we are still having success from an economic development standpoint, and this is how we can frame it that way. And it was interesting to watch, them kind of internalize that information, and think about how they can, incorporate it into the narrative that they're building, not just for businesses. Obviously, that's a huge asset for businesses to know that they're going to be operating a community that's extremely efficient, has an efficient workforce. But also, what does it look like for their community to feel a little bit better about its economy and the success that they're having? So anyway, leave you with that story. I think as you think about how to leverage your data to build consensus and create action in your community, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. This is like a 101 version of that. So if you have any specific questions, I tried to keep it high level so it's related for everybody. But please reach out. I'm always happy to talk strategy with someone, and certainly would love to have that conversation. My contact information is here, and yeah, I look forward to talking with those of you that are interested. And just as you continue to grow your community, know that there's a lot of other people that are trying to figure this out as well. And I think SEDC is a great network for you to bounce ideas off of one another. And so again, grateful for SEDC and all the work that they do. So